Welcome to my presentation on the rise of Jacksonian democracy. This is an exciting period in American history. I hope you'll agree. Still a controversial one as well, especially with this man right here, the $20 bill, at the center of all things. Now, this is really the only time that we um, historians have used a man's name to describe an entire period for a long time. Now, some historians are moving away from this, but if they say Jacksonian America, then we still understand you're talking about the 18 teens and 20s, 30s, and 40s. Jacksonian America. Well, obviously, he's not president during all that time. He just has two terms in the middle of that, really. But he's so central to many developments that he does seem quite central to it. Now, there's other names we perhaps could use, but no one is as pivotal as Andrew Jackson, for people either hate him or they loved him. And he becomes the symbol of the common man in this period. And that's really what we're talking about with the rise of Jacksonian democracy. We're talking about the rise of the common man, common white man at least. Jackson is not exactly a champion of the rise of common minorities, but he does become an example of a white man who is not born into privilege, not born well off, but makes something of himself. If you follow the introductory music that I provided here, I think it's one of the most perfect songs for the lesson we're going to talk about. The song is just called Common Man, and it celebrates everything about being average. Where in the world would anyone get the idea that it's actually a bragging point to talk about how average you are, to talk about how you're not overly educated, you're not overly rich, you're just average? Well, Jacksonian democracy helps explain a lot of that, and how being just an average American became actually a bragging point. So, in this presentation, we'll talk about some of this phenomenon, what was happening socially, culturally in America at this time. But we'll mainly focus on the person of Andrew Jackson. We'll talk about um, how he rises to be the president and how that is going to change things. We won't say a lot about specifically about what he does in office. We'll save that for another day, but we'll talk about just the phenomenon of the rise of this common man Jacksonian democracy. Let's begin. First of all, we need to understand that when Jackson comes along, as he is maturing and will become a political figure, major changes were already underway socially, um, politically, culturally in America. There was already a growing sense of equality among people. We might say that some of that comes from the Revolutionary War. You might recall we talked about George Robert Twelves Hughes, a man who felt like he was the equal of even great people like John Hancock once he had fought in the Revolutionary War. That was the great equalizer. Well, those trends had continued to grow. It wasn't overnight suddenly that everyone felt a sense of democracy, but in the late 1700s, early 1800s, there's been this growing sense of democracy, growing social equality, and that has to be present for there to ever be a President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, it would be unthinkable for someone with his background to have been elected president, um, as in the very early stages, with George Washington, John Adams. You had to be pretty elite, um, and well born. All the presidents before Jackson had been. But sometimes one way to see how things have changed is to see things through an outsider's eyes. And Frances Trollope is a good example. Frances Trollope is an outsider. She was not an American. She was a British woman who moves to America in the Jacksonian period. late 1820s and early 1830s. And she writes about her experiences here. Now, much of what she sees was further west. She's not always along the East Coast. She's places along the Mississippi River or later in Cincinnati as well. I don't mean west as in California, but still westward as far as population had migrated away from the East Coast. So she wasn't always seeing big city development, but she was experiencing a lot of this social change in America. And she writes about it in a book called The Domestic Manners of the American People. Spoiler alert, she's not impressed with the domestic manners of the American people. She's quite frustrated, in fact, because she thinks Americans think that they're just as good as anyone, even when they have no evidence to show for it. This was really, really perturbing to her when it came to finding a servant girl. Frances Trollope comes from a fairly aristocratic background. Her family may have been losing some money, but she still wanted to maintain that status. But she always had trouble finding suitable American servants because they um, they didn't really want to stay servants. They didn't feel honored and privileged to work for her. In fact, they were pretty bold about asking for money in advance, even if they hadn't worked a day. They just wanted to work long enough to, maybe buy a pretty dress for a dance coming up. And they certainly were not going to tolerate being looked down upon or being, barked at or ordered around. And so she constantly went through different servants. They work for a little while, they leave, they don't show up. And she didn't understand this. Why is it so hard to find a good servant in America? Well, many of those servant girls felt like we're just as good as anybody else. I'm not really taking orders from someone else, so I will put in some work to raise myself economically. I'm not going to be subjected to someone's tyrannies. Trollope didn't understand this. Um, she criticized many other things in America. She didn't like when you get on a stagecoach when you're traveling by wagon. There's not really preferred seating. There's not really first class and second class. It's just sort of first come, first serve. And not all men are going to get up and say, let the lady have the seat instead. No, they just kind of pile in. They put their luggage or their trunks right on your way, on your feet, your lap. Um, she didn't understand that. She hated that Americans are always spitting, chewing tobacco and spitting. It's a gross, nasty habit. I happen to agree with Trollope on that, but she says it was just almost universal. People are uncouth everywhere. If you go to the theater, Americans are not respectful at the theater. They don't wait for the actors to perform. They're interacting, they're yelling back at the actors, maybe throwing things at the actors if they don't like the play. Francis Trollope just came away thinking America is a very uncouth, unsavory kind of place where people are very, very protective of their patriotism. If you say anything negative about America in general, you will be chewed out. You are an outsider. Well, many examples throughout that book, Francis Trollope was experiencing. We didn't have a name for it yet, but it was Jacksonian democracy. It was the growth of the common man, and being an aristocratic woman, she's very uncomfortable with it. Well, changes that were taking place in politics would also help explain how Andrew Jackson could become a president. In politics, this is the most important development, that in politics, property restrictions on voting were being reduced along the East Coast or eliminated altogether, and they're never put in place in newer Western states. What I mean is, every state had some restrictions on who could vote. They don't just let every man, woman, and child vote. In fact, they don't ever even let every man vote. There's age restrictions and there's property restrictions. Every state would have a different amount of property that you must have to be a voter. Um, the idea was if you don't own anything, then why should you vote on anything? Because most voting, most politics has something to do with property. And so if you don't have any property, why do you get a say in what happens with property? Well, in the original 13 colonies, 13 states, they all had property restrictions. But as newer states are being established, Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, there are no property restrictions. That means more common white men are going to be voting. And even on the East Coast, many of those states were adjusting their constitution and allowing a broader electorate. This is the key. This is how someone that is more like the common man can be elected. There is no popular vote for the presidency in George Washington's day, but by the time we get to Andrew Jackson, there'll be a much larger electorate. There'll be there'll be a popular vote. Now, electoral votes are still what matters, but there's still going to be a lot more people taking part in politics and having a say in who those electors should be. Kind of similar to this, um, political parties used to select their candidates simply by a private meeting of the party called a caucus. Well, this was still going on in the early Jacksonian period, but it's starting to be replaced by national conventions. So major parties get together. It's not just a private meeting of their leaders, not just a private meeting of their actual congressmen or senators. Now we're having more say by more people to determine who the candidates ought to be, who can be elected. So major changes that were taking place socially, politically, they help explain the rise of Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson's background, whether someone is a friend or foe, whether they admire his character or despise him, it's a fascinating story how this young man rises to prominence in America. Um, because, as I mentioned, it is a common man's childhood. He's not a wealthy plantation owner, as most presidents had been before him. He's not born into a well-off family. In fact, he's born into a poor family along the South Carolina, North Carolina border. He's on the South Carolina side, but not along the coast where there were richer plantations. He's born out in the backwoods and in an area that still has frequent conflict with Native Americans. It was a rough area, and he was part of the growing population of Scotch Irish people, um, typically Presbyterian in their faith, um, strict Calvinists, who lived in that area. And Jackson grew up there, but he grew up without a father. At least he couldn't remember there being him having a father. His father died when he was still very, very young. So he's just raised by his mom, and mom moves in with extended family. They basically move in with an uncle, because the uncle had lost his wife as well. Now, Jackson's mom doesn't marry the uncle, but they do sort of raise a blended family here where um, Miss Jackson still felt like she has to mother the cousins just as much as she does Andrew and her other two boys. So it's a poor blended family here. And um, Jackson was Jackson was a teenager when the American Revolution came to South Carolina. He actually takes part in the revolution in a way. His older brothers can play a little more part, but Jackson would be um, somewhat of a spy. You can be a young man, teenager, you can kind of keep your ears open. Maybe you hear something from a British officer and you can take that information back. The Civil War, I'm sorry, the Revolutionary War in South Carolina was one of the nastiest area as far as brother killing brother. South Carolina was very divided. A lot of loyalists there, a lot of patriots there. You weren't really sure who you could trust. But Jackson was certainly on the side of the patriots when he gets captured by the British. And he was brought before a British officer who wanted Jackson to shine his muddy boots. He's asking him to do a servant kind of thing. And very young Andrew Jackson refused to do it. Now, that's pretty bold when you're a kid and you're a prisoner of war. You're probably pretty scared, I'm sure. Normally you would be, but he refuses to shine another man's shoes. And so the British officer was very upset. He took out his sword and he slashed at Jackson. Don't think he was trying to take his head off, but he certainly wanted to teach him a lesson. And he slaps him across the face, gives him a permanent scar there where it cut his face. Well, that showed you something about Jackson's character. He's a tough little kid, not really afraid of anyone or anything, even when maybe he should be. Well, when the Revolutionary War ends, Jackson loses everything. Um, his brothers both die just shortly after the war. One from sickness, and Jackson was very sick as well. And his mom really couldn't take care of just them because she had the cousins to take care of as well. But his mom contracts illness as well, and all of his immediate family is dead shortly after the Revolutionary War. Now, for most cases, this may just send someone into um, a downward spiral. Jackson may have never made anything of himself, but he takes what little money that he inherits. He has a little money from a grandfather. Nobody's rich, but as the only person in this family, he inherits a little money, and he goes off to North Carolina and starts spending money. This is his phase, almost like a prodigal son. He is betting on horse races. He's gambling. He's spending money like you might think a teenage boy would do if he's just living on his own with no restraints whatsoever. That's Andrew Jackson. He's living hard and probably going to die young. Something made him realize that this is not a lifestyle that's going to have a long future. He's going to have to do something to pull himself up, make himself something. And so he decides to become a lawyer. Now, today, if you want to be a lawyer, you need to plan much further ahead. You need to think about how you get a good LSAT score. You need to think about what you major in college that's going to prepare you for law school. You need to think about your GPA. So Jackson doesn't do any of those things. He hasn't had that kind of formal education. Um, what he does, what people could do in that day, was just attach yourself to a lawyer who's willing to um, train you, willing to let you read their law books. You become almost like an apprentice lawyer. You learn by doing it. You learn by watching someone be a lawyer. That's what Jackson does. But there were lots of lawyers in North Carolina. In all likelihood, if he stayed there, he might not have been the great Andrew Jackson later. But he does make an important decision to move west, to go just west of North Carolina, go into Tennessee, and he's going to be right there on the ground floor of a brand new state where he's going to become one of its founding fathers. Now, what's going to really make Jackson stand out in Tennessee and nationally is really his military experience. Again, it's not because he's had a great deal of military training. He was a teenager during the Revolutionary War. He wasn't organizing troops. He doesn't really know anything about military, but he reads and he's going to learn while doing. Some of his most famous military exploits, of course, though, go back to the War of 1812. Jackson was, by then, had become a pretty prominent person in Tennessee. I'll explain a little more about that later. But he had become pretty prominent and was, when he heard that this war is breaking out and there's Indian war that goes along with the war between the United States and Great Britain. British were encouraging Native Americans to fight against the United States. And the Creek Indians in the Southeast, many of the Creek Indians had unleashed war against American settlers. One fort had been wiped out, killing over 100 people in along the Southeast, like Alabama and Mississippi. This is where the war was taking place. So just south of Tennessee. Well, Jackson decides he's going to lead a group to go and fight against the Creek Indians. But really, this is a civil war among the Creeks. Some Creek Indians believed that their best hope was fighting against the United States, while the British are going to fight them too. Other Creek Indians thought, no, we're going to be stuck with the United States no matter what happens with Great Britain. So it's best to stay on friendly terms with them. So the Creek Indians are fighting each other. It's a civil war that Jackson's going to get involved in as well, because he's going to punish those Creeks for wiping out Fort Mims. Well, Jackson leads a group on the campaign to fight against the Creeks, and he's very successful, defeating them one place after another. The ultimate was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, where Jackson and his men and his Indian allies, he's got Creek and Cherokee Indian allies, they come to a place, a bend in the river, Tallapoosa River, where the Creek Indians had fortified. They basically just built a giant fence, more than just a fence, a fortification across this place where the river makes kind of a horseshoe bend. So, they are all safely behind that, unless you can get on the other side of the river and attack from that side, or you can breach that giant fortification. That's what Jackson and his men, his Indian allies, are going to do, and they just wipe out this group of Creek Indians. It goes beyond just a battle; it's a massacre once they breach that wall and kill hundreds and hundreds of Creek Indians there. So, in the midst of this war, Jackson becomes well known as an Indian fighter and a very successful military leader as part of this War of 1812. But that's not all. The final battle of the War of 1812 was the Battle of New Orleans. It actually takes place when the war is officially over. The peace treaty was being signed, but it hadn't been, officially approved. Word had not gotten back to the United States that we've got a treaty. We just need to approve it and end the war with Great Britain. Nothing will change. We'll just go back to the way things were pre-war. But in the meantime, Jackson was getting ready to defend New Orleans. The British were about to invade New Orleans, and if they could take possession of New Orleans, they could probably change the terms of that treaty as well. Because controlling New Orleans would mean you control the Mississippi River, the opening to it. So it's very important that Jackson hold on to New Orleans. Well, not only does he hold on to it, he inflicts heavy casualties on the British professional soldiers who come in, and they march Jackson and his men, a motley crew of his people from the South, some Indian allies, pirates. They're just a wild mixture of people, not professional soldiers, who defend New Orleans and um, and inflict about 2,500 casualties on the British while losing just a few people on their own. It is an incredible lopsided win, so much so that Jackson's star will rise like no one since George Washington. George Washington never had a victory like the Battle of New Orleans, never such a one sided win. And people will be praising this Andrew Jackson, this common man, no real military training, who obviously has understood something about military because he's won this most important battle against the Creek Indians and this most important battle finishing the War of 1812. Jackson is becoming noticed because of his military exploits. And after the war, Jackson is called into service again um, in Florida because in Florida, Florida was still Spanish territory, and Florida was an inviting place for slaves in Georgia to run away to. It's an inviting place for Seminole Indians in Florida to just cross the border, raid something in Georgia, and then go back to the safety of Spanish territory. So Jackson and another military leader were called upon to go into Florida and stop these Indian raids. Yes, this is an invasion of another country's territory, Spain. Um, and the administration, this was President James Monroe, does not really want all-out war with Spain, but he does want these raids to stop, and it seems that Spain is either unwilling to stop them or unable to stop them. So Jackson goes in and he goes beyond the orders that he was given. At least that's what the Monroe administration claims. He goes beyond his orders because he's not really supposed to attack any Spanish towns, but he does go in and take over Pensacola, um, and and he fights in Indian villages as well. And he'll even find a couple of British citizens living in Florida. Jackson believes these men are both also encouraging Indian raids. So they have a military trial. And even though one of the men is not found guilty, they find more evidence that one may be cooperating with Indian raids, but Jackson has them both executed. This has potential for enormous international problems. I mean, we're not only invading Spanish Florida, executing English citizens again. Do we want to start up round three with Great Britain? The Monroe administration is distraught over this. They don't know, what are we going to do about this rogue general? Well, Jackson claims he was not going beyond orders, that some of the orders that they think they communicated to him perhaps never arrived. Um, he went in with some discretionary power to make sure that these raids stop. So while most of the Monroe administration was highly critical of Jackson and wanted to reprimand him, there was one member of the cabinet who thought perhaps this could be a useful situation. Um, and that was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Now, this is interesting because Jackson and John Quincy Adams will later be enemies. But the son of President John Adams, John Quincy Adams, at this moment thought what Jackson has done can be useful. As Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams would like to negotiate with Spain the purchase of Florida. And what Jackson has done is shown that we can take Florida and not pay you anything for it. Or we could do it the easy way. We could pay you some money and you give us Florida. And we'll work out, boundary issues on the west too. Spain still has New Spain, which is Mexico. Um, so that's what Adams does. John Quincy Adams negotiates this, what's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, or the Adams-Onis. The Adams-Onis Treaty that transfers Florida to the United States in 1819. And it settles the boundary between the United States and New Spain. Jackson um, Jackson gets credit for helping make that possible, and John Quincy Adams gets credit for actually doing the negotiation. So Jackson is an important but controversial figure in Florida. I went to Florida State University and for my PhD, and I'll never forget when my wife and I were there the first spring. Um, they had their traditional springtime Tallahassee parade, and there had always been a figure dressed as an Andrew Jackson to lead the parade. But because history is constantly under revision, there was controversy about that. Some people in Tallahassee thought there shouldn't be an Andrew Jackson in this parade. Jackson stands for invasion and Indian war and slave ownership. We don't want him in this parade. Other people would say, look, he's pretty important in this state. He's maybe the main reason this territory ever came into the United States. And he's an important president. He's part of the history of all of the Southeast. So there was controversy. They finally settled on let there be an Andrew Jackson in the parade, just don't let him lead it. He'll be walking somewhere in the middle. Well, my wife and I are watching as the Andrew Jackson character walks by, and other protesters come out and they throw, I guess it was red Kool-Aid. It didn't look like real blood, but they just throw this red Kool-Aid out in front of Andrew Jackson. This is the blood you spilled. Jackson still gets under people's skin, a couple of centuries later. Um, so Jackson, still a very important and controversial figure. Well, he becomes a politician after all this military exploit, and um, and has some local positions, as a judge. In those days, in a place like Tennessee, a judge didn't always just sit behind a desk and wait for cases to be brought to him. Sometimes it meant you have to go make the arrest of a dangerous person that everyone's afraid to bring before a judge, and Jackson would do it. He's not afraid of anyone or anything. Um, he he was a successful local judge. He was even a congressman for a short time. He would represent Tennessee in Congress. Not especially effective here. Most other congressmen said he would stand up to try to speak. He'd get so agitated about something, he just really couldn't control his temper and could hardly get words out. At least that's what some of his opponents as congressmen would say, that he's not a very effective um, congressman. But because of his military exploits, because of his popularity, he was a potential presidential candidate. Now, Jackson's involved in some of the most interesting presidential elections in our history. In 1824, there's a lot of people running for president. And what's really significant about this campaign is we're back to no political parties, really. The Federalists are dead and gone. And so everyone basically is a Jacksonian Republican or a Democratic Republican. But there's people from different regions of the country, and they think they would be the best um, Jeffersonian Republican um, to represent the party and the whole nation. So we have a bunch of different candidates, including, but not limited to, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson. There's also a John C. Calhoun of South Carolina that was running early on, and a William Crawford from Georgia that was running. But these are the most important here because um, John Quincy Adams, I mentioned, was already Secretary of State. His father had been president. He has been really groomed to be president more than anyone ever had been. When Andrew Jackson was having a tough time as a teenager or living on his own in North Carolina. John Quincy Adams, at that same age, was a diplomat in Europe. He, as a teenager, he was at least serving as a translator for American diplomats in Russia, in the Netherlands, with his father in England. He didn't need to be a translator in England, but he has been involved in foreign service from his youth, um, and um, he knows what being a president is going to be like. Um, Now, Henry Clay is another kind of Western star who's risen not so much because of military, but certainly because of the War of 1812. Henry Clay was one of the main congressmen pushing for that war in Kentucky, and he's been the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He is an up and coming, very prominent politician. And then you've got these others. Well, there's a popular vote for president. We can actually look back and see how many people voted for each of these candidates. Although the popular vote doesn't determine the winner, but Andrew Jackson got more popular votes than anyone. And then when you look at, okay, well, what electoral votes did that give you when you win the election in Pennsylvania or you win in Tennessee? Well, Jackson had more electoral votes than anyone also. He had 99 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams had 84. And then the others, it dwindled off, having 41 and 39, quite a bit less than Jackson and Adams. But no one had 50% of the electoral votes because there were 5 candidates. Um, there's just um, Jackson has a plurality, he has more votes than anyone, but not 50%. So, according to the Constitution, what happens then is the House of Representatives will decide who is going to become the next president. They'll look at the top 3 and decide who should be the next president. Well, that means Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. Clay had just barely missed being the 3rd place vote getter. And so Clay can't be in this runoff to be decided in the House of Representatives. That might have been interesting if he had gotten, just 2 more electoral votes, because he was Speaker of the House. He has more influence in the House than anyone. Could Henry Clay have been chosen president, even though he got 3rd in the electoral count? Who knows? By the way, John C. Calhoun. There's too many 3-name people here. Calhoun had already settled for just being vice president. He pulled out of the presidential race. He was young enough that he knew he'd have chances in the future. So Calhoun's already settled for being vice president. By the way, they've already changed how they do electoral votes now. There's no more cast your vote for 2 people. There's a separate vote for president and vice president now. That changes after the crazy 1800 election we talked about. So now the House was trying to decide between those 3, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. Well, Crawford actually was the choice of the party caucus. The private meeting still said, William Crawford is the most like Thomas Jefferson. He should be president. But that's not the way things are going to work anymore. Crawford had a stroke. He was already going to be debilitated coming into office. It's really coming down to Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And the House decides John Quincy Adams should be the next president. Well, Andrew Jackson felt cheated. His supporters felt like the will of the people has been ignored because he was clearly the most popular choice. He had more electoral votes, significantly more than Adams did. And it's just the House that decides Adams is a better fit for president. Jackson felt cheated, he feels cheated, especially when he finds out who John Quincy Adams is going to appoint as the new Secretary of State. Adams appoints Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. And when that happens, Jackson supporters say this was a corrupt bargain. This was a deal that was already worked out. Imagine they're thinking it looked something like this. Adams says, Clay, you have a lot of influence in the House. If you help me be elected, I can help you in the future by making you Secretary of State. Because what has happened to secretaries of state in the past? Well, they always become president, or at least a lot of them have. It's worked for Adams, it worked for James Monroe, for James Madison. Thomas Jefferson was a secretary of state. That's several in a row here that being Secretary of State is the stepping stone to being president. Now, there's no evidence, no concrete evidence that Adams and Clay worked out some bargain in advance. When you just look at what each person stands for and what policies they would approve, Clay would, of course, want himself to be president first, but if he couldn't be president, Adams would probably be the next most like his political view. So, of course, Clay would support Adams. They're similar in policy view. But as far as Jackson and his supporters are concerned, this was a corrupt bargain. This was a way that some elites cheat and keep the common man choice from president. We won't say much about John Quincy Adams' presidency, but we'll just jump straight to the next contest because 1828 is even a stranger election. In 1828, there's not 5 candidates. It's really just a showdown between John Quincy Adams, the sitting president, and Andrew Jackson, the challenger. And in this election, it really gets nasty. There's more character attacks and slanders against one another than in any election that I can think of. I know you might be sickened when it's political season and you hear what one candidate's going to say about the other one. And you might get tired of all the mudslinging, but let me assure you, that's not new. That is a very old tradition, and we've not surpassed 1828 for how nasty the character attacks can become. Now, here are some of the character attacks that people said about Andrew Jackson. Opponents of Andrew Jackson would say this man should not be president because he is a murderer. He's a murderer. Well, they're not talking about victory at New Orleans. They're not even really talking about victory at Horseshoe Bend. Those were things that made him a hero. No, they're talking about the way he treated his soldiers. He had several of them executed who were threatening to run away. They'll exploit that, and they'll say, Andrew Jackson's a murderer because look at these good volunteers that he had executed when he didn't really need to. But they're also talking about his temper. Jackson has killed a man in a duel. Well, it was true. Andrew Jackson, when he was pretty new to Tennessee, he was just a young man that had come to Tennessee and was trying to rise up as a lawyer, start making some money and owning land, becoming a plantation owner. As he's making his economic rise in Tennessee, he and another man named Dickinson get into an argument involving horse races, betting, and the man, makes the mistake of saying something about Andrew Jackson's wife, and therefore he's going to challenge the man to a duel. Now, other people that knew this man better said, you do not want a duel with Mr. Dickinson because he's fast and he's accurate. But Jackson's not afraid of anyone or anything, so he goes to the dueling grounds to protect his honor and the honor of his wife. Well, um, the way duels worked, it's not like a Wild West movie where you walk 10 paces away and then suddenly turn and you'll have a quick draw. People stood a certain distance apart from one another, facing one another, and then um, one could decide, whoever wants to shoot first can go. Um, and once that first person has shot, the other one has to stand. That person who has shot has to stand still for a count of 1, 2, 3, while the other person has a chance to return fire. Now, these pistols are not extremely accurate. They're shooting a musket ball. But Jackson was facing Mr. Dickinson. Dickinson shoots and is shocked that Jackson has not fallen down. He thought, how could I miss? Dickinson never misses. Well, in fact, he hadn't missed. He hit Jackson in the chest. It just didn't kill him. It didn't knock him down. Jackson absorbs the blow and then readies himself because now Dickinson's got to stand still. 1, 2, 3, and Jackson kills him. Well, Jackson walks around with that bullet in him for many years till he's an old man and it's able to be removed. So for his opponents, they say this is not the character of a president, someone who engages in a duel. Can you imagine Thomas Jefferson, getting into arguments and fights like this and shooting somebody? Well, they would also say about Andrew Jackson, he's an adulterer. Yeah. Well, there's some truth to that as well. When Jackson first moved to Tennessee, he lived in a boarding house. That means it's like a set of apartments, but they all share the same kitchen. And so there could be multiple families or individuals living there. Well, he lived there, and there was also a woman named Rachel Donaldson who had um, who was married. She was Rachel Robards. She was married, but when Jackson moved into the boarding house, um, Rachel started having marital problems. The marital problems were probably already there, but she and her husband were having trouble. The husband moved out, and before long, Andrew Jackson and Rachel Donaldson start a relationship, and they fall in love. They get married, but Rachel was still married to the first man. There was no divorce finalized. In fact, when she does get a divorce, it's the first divorce in the state of Tennessee. So Rachel and Andrew managed to keep this kind of quiet, but once he's a presidential candidate again, people are going to dig and find out this man was married to someone who was married to another man at the same time. He's an adulterer. She's a um, polygamist. She's married to multiple people at the same time. They really are going to attack him for this and attack Rachel as well. What kind of woman is this? Well, for Jackson's supporters, this doesn't bother them too much. Even though divorce was very rare, Jackson supporters say this is a passionate man who wears his heart out on his sleeve. You know exactly how he feels. He's not secretive or conniving, and he doesn't just follow conventions because that's the thing to do. He will follow his heart, and that's an admirable thing to do. These are the things that they're saying against Andrew Jackson: murderer, adulterer. But Jackson people say nasty things about John Quincy Adams too. They accuse him of abuse of power and of money because he brings a pool table into the White House. Well, opponents say John Quincy Adams has brought this pool table. The pool table is already kind of associated with gambling, maybe a little less than moral. But they're trying to imply that Adams is buying this with, just public expense accounts. You're helping pay for John Quincy Adams to have a pool table in his house. The truth was, Adams just buys this with his own money. It's not something he writes an expense account and says, the people need to make my living in the White House more comfortable. The big accusation, though, against Adams was that when he was a diplomat in Russia, when he's um, serving as translator there, the accusation was he was also bringing American girls in as, for the sexual pleasure of the Russian czar. They didn't have this word yet, but basically they're saying John Quincy Adams was a pimp in Russia. Okay, now that's some pretty good mudslinging here. They're saying adulterer, murderer, pimp. That gets pretty nasty. Well, there was no truth to this either. John Quincy Adams was not bringing sex slaves to the Russian czar, but he was certainly going to suffer from this accusation of the corrupt bargain, and the fact that he had become president without really having more votes than Jackson. Well, this election is not really that close. There's not 5 people in the race, and Jackson's going to win the election quite handily. Now, I'll say more specific about his presidency, but just in closing here, real briefly, the inauguration is a wild party. Jackson shows up dressed all in black, and he mumbles out a speech that people didn't really remember that much. But there's a huge crowd there because he is their man. He's the symbol of the common man. And this huge crowd follows him to the presidential mansion when he gets back on horseback and heads to his house. This scene here, this picture is supposed to be showing that scene where there's just lots of people crowded into the White House. They smash glasses. It becomes so unruly. Jackson doesn't even spend the night there. He goes to stay in a boarding house for the night. And so opponents of his look at this crowd and they say, that's democracy. That's what the followers of Andrew Jackson get us. When you open up voting this much and have the common man involved, this is what you get. You don't get the best person, you just get the person that represents the mob, the crowd. Well, as a president, Jackson certainly would champion the common man. He believed that common people can do government jobs, that it's not something that only the elite can do. So he very much thought that people should serve in the government for a short time and then they should get out. They should not be career politicians, career bureaucrats. So he institutes these ways of getting people out of their government bureaucracies and replacing them with new people. We use the term campaign all the time when we talk about political campaigns. But really, the term campaign has more to do originally with military campaign. It's your strategy. How are you going to go and defeat the enemy? Well, in Jackson's day, politics has become more like a war. It is military. And Jackson, like in military, says, to the winner goes the spoils. If you win the campaign, you get the spoils of war. The spoils of war here could be political appointments. The president can appoint a new cabinet. The president can appoint people to the post office and tax collectors and a multiplicity of other jobs. If you've won the campaign, you get the spoils. So Jackson does seem to reward his supporters much more than people in the past had done, and he removes a lot more people out of government offices than anyone had done before. That's what office rotation was. You've served in the government, you've been in this bureaucracy for a while, but this doesn't need to be a career. You served the country, now get out and let another common man come in and do this government job. If you're constantly in government, you're just living off of the rest of the country. Serve your time and then leave. Office rotation. Jackson believes any common man can come in and do these government jobs. Well, let me skip ahead just to close here because I want you to see how Andrew Jackson's impact is going to be felt even among his opponents. He's going to be president elected in 1828 and in 32. And then he won't run a third time, but basically it will be one of his proteges, Martin Van Buren, that serves the next term. It would be kind of like a Jackson third term. But the opponents, his opposition, who's going to be called the Whig Party eventually, the Whig Party was going to learn from Andrew Jackson how to win an election. And we see that in 1840. In 1840, Martin Van Buren was still president. He's running for re-election. But the Whig Party, party against Andrew Jackson, they have their own military hero to run now. William Henry Harrison was also famous War of 1812 military hero. He's also an Indian fighter in that same war. While Andrew Jackson's winning battles in the Southeast, William Henry Harrison was successful in the North, the Battle of Tippecanoe. So the Whigs have learned you need to find a military man and you need to present him as a common man. The Whigs are going to sing songs about William Henry Harrison and say, this guy is a log cabin candidate. He's born in a log cabin. He's a common man. That wasn't technically true. He was a pretty well-to-do man and had been born well-to-do in Virginia. But the Whigs are going to portray him as a common man. He's average, just like you. They're going to present that as a badge of honor. He's just a common man, drives a common van. Well, go back to the song there. So the Whigs are going to present him as a common man. They're going to say he doesn't sip champagne. He's not real fancy. He drinks hard cider whiskey. He's not some fancy rich European like Martin Van Buren. What kind of fancy name is that? Well, it's just a Dutch name, really, but it makes it sound more regal and more, more cosmopolitan. William Henry Harrison would win this election because the Whigs will convince everyone, vote for old Tippecanoe, and John Tyler, too. That was the vice president. Harrison wins the election, and as he gives his inaugural speech and thanks the crowd for electing him, he'll be getting a little sick because it's rainy. He's contracting pneumonia, and he stays out really late, thanking this whole crowd, shaking lots of hands, getting lots of germs. And William Henry Harrison dies just a few weeks after this inaugural. So maybe there's a lesson in that for all of us. There's some danger in trying to just appeal to the common man or present yourself as the champion of the crowd. It kills William Henry Harrison. But in Jacksonian America, it was essential. You've got to appear to be like everyone else in order to be successful in politics. We'll talk more about this in the videos ahead. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a good one.